I'm Nathan, and welcome back to Cheating Tales Lab. Tonight's story starts with a load of laundry. That sounds small, I know, but stay with me, because I've learned that betrayal almost never announces itself with a slammed door or a lipstick stain. It shows up in the quiet logistics of a household: who gets packed for, who gets cooked for, and who, at 12 years old, is standing alone in a dark house at midnight, washing his own clothes, because nobody else will. The man in tonight's story came home 2 days early from a work trip and found exactly that. He found a note on the refrigerator that I still can't read out loud without my jaw tightening. And then his son, calm as you like, folded a shirt, looked up, and said 8 words that turned the whole thing inside out. Here's what I want you to watch for tonight: the difference between anger and patience. Anger is loud and it burns out fast. Patience is quiet and it keeps receipts. This father had 5 days while the people who hurt his boy were out at sea, unreachable, sipping drinks they didn't pay for. 5 days is a long time in the hands of the right man. This is his story. Dalton Creel could tell you whether a signature was real from across a table, and he could usually tell you what a person was worth, not in dollars, in character, inside of 10 minutes. It was the family joke, back when his family was whole. His first wife, Celia, used to say he'd been born with an auctioneer's eye and a locksmith's patience, and that the combination made him impossible to buy a surprise gift for. Dalton was a certified estate and fine art appraiser. The man banks and probate courts called when somebody died and left behind a house full of things that might be junk and might be a fortune. He'd grown up watching his mother clean those same kinds of houses in the wealthy end of the county. A single mom with 2 jobs and a rule she repeated like a prayer: "We don't take what isn't ours, baby, because a thing you steal never stops belonging to somebody else." Dalton built a career on that rule. Provenance, he liked to say, is just a story you can prove. He'd testified in courtrooms, caught forged Audubon prints and faked Civil War letters, and earned a quiet reputation across the state of Maryland. If Creel signs off on it, it's real. Celia was the other half of that life. They'd met at a flea market in Ostray, the little brick harbor town where Dalton still lived, when she outbid him on a box of broken pocket watches and then, seeing his face, offered to split it. She restored old jewelry at a bench by the window of their house on Tillman Street, and when their son Rory was born, she hung a tiny brass compass over his crib and told him it would always point home. Rory came out quiet and precise, a kid who lined his crayons up by height, who took apart the toaster at 7 and put it back together better. He was 9 when Celia got sick, and 10 when she died, and in the last week of her life she pressed her cameo locket, the one her own grandmother had carried through Ellis Island, into Dalton's hand and said, "This is Rory's someday. Tell him it points home too." After the funeral, the locket went into Celia's jewelry box on the dresser. 6 months later, it was gone. Dalton tore the house apart twice. He blamed the movers who'd hauled Celia's workbench to storage, blamed his own grief-fogged head, and finally stopped talking about it, because every mention put a crack in Rory's face that took days to close. That missing locket was the one case the great Dalton Creel never solved. Remember the locket. It matters. He met Annika Duval 2 years after Celia passed, and looking back, the meeting was so smooth it should have squeaked. She turned up at an estate auction, where Dalton was the appraiser of record. Mid-30s, polished, funny in a low voice, the kind of woman who remembered your coffee order the second time she saw you. She worked with her mother's company, Duval Estate Liquidations, the biggest estate sale outfit in that corner of Maryland. Her mother, Henrietta Duval, was a fixture in 3 counties. Silver-haired, church on Sundays, sat on the hospital auxiliary board, hugged widows at funerals, and then handled the sale of everything the dead had left behind. People called her a saint. Henrietta ran her family the way she ran her sales. Everything tagged, everything priced, everything hers. There was a brother, Rudy, who drove the box truck and cleared houses. A sister, Joelle, who did the books. And around them, a comet's tail of cousins and in-laws who showed up wherever Henrietta pointed. Annika was the jewel of the operation, the closer, the one who sat with grieving families at their kitchen tables and got the contract signed. Dalton, a widower with a paid-off house, a respected license, and a lonely kid. Dalton never had a chance. He just didn't know yet that he'd been appraised. The wedding was small, and the takeover was total. Within a year, Henrietta had sold her own drafty farmhouse, at a tidy profit, through her own company, and moved into the in-law suite at the back of the Tillman Street house, the one with the big locked oak cupboard she'd brought on Rudy's truck, wrapped in moving blankets like a coffin. "It's Louis Quinze," she told Dalton when he offered to appraise it. "Family pieces, sentimental, you understand." She kept the only key on a ribbon around her neck. Dalton, who had spent his whole life respecting other people's locks, let it be. That was the year the temperature started dropping for Rory. It happened the way frost happens. No single moment. Just one morning you notice the ground is hard. Annika's warmth toward the boy, so convincing during the courtship, developed a schedule, on when Dalton was home, off when he traveled. Rory's drawings came off the refrigerator to make room for cruise brochures. His chair at Sunday dinners migrated toward the end of the table, then to a folding chair, then to a plate left on the counter. Joelle's twins got new bikes in the driveway. Rory got told that 11 was old enough to stop expecting Christmas to be a production. And Henrietta had a way of talking about Rory in the third person while he stood right there. The boy tracks mud. The boy eats like a field hand. The boy is not, strictly speaking, family, is he? He's the previous administration. Dalton pushed back, and this is where you have to understand how good these people were. Every time he raised it, the scene got flipped before he finished a sentence. Annika would cry, actual tears, on demand, and say she was trying so hard with a child who wouldn't let her in. And did Dalton have any idea how it felt to compete with a dead woman? Henrietta would lay a soft hand on his arm and murmur that grief makes fathers see monsters where there are only growing pains. They were fluent in a language Dalton was only starting to learn, the grammar of making a decent man doubt his own eyes. And Dalton's work schedule did the rest. His reputation meant contracts up and down the coast, 2 weeks authenticating a collection in Savannah, 10 days on a museum deaccession in Pittsburgh. He'd call home every night, and Annika would hold the phone up so he could hear a household that sounded warm. And Rory learned to say, "I'm fine, Dad," in a voice specifically engineered not to worry anyone. Kids do that. They protect the parent they have left. It's the bravest, saddest thing in the world, and it works, which is the problem. That October, Dalton took a 3-week contract cataloging a shipping magnate's collection outside Charleston, the biggest fee of his year, the job he almost turned down. Annika practically packed his bags. Her whole family had been humming for weeks about something. Conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, Henrietta on the phone with her voice pitched low, Rudy grinning at him across the yard like a man who knows the punchline. Dalton put it down to the Duvals being the Duvals. He kissed Rory's head, told him to hold the fort, and drove south. The job collapsed 19 days in. A dispute between heirs froze the whole estate. Lawyers descended, and the client paid out his contract and sent everyone home. Dalton didn't call ahead. He'd tell you now that he doesn't fully know why. 20 years of reading rooms, maybe. Some appraiser's instinct that the story he'd been told about his own house wouldn't survive an unannounced inspection. He drove 11 hours straight, and at 4 minutes past midnight he turned onto Tillman Street and found his home standing dark. Not asleep dark, empty dark. No cars, no porch light, and from the basement, one thin blade of yellow under the door, and the sound of the dryer turning, and his 12-year-old son standing at the folding table in the half-light, working through a basket of his own laundry with the focused, unhurried motions of a boy who has done this alone many times before. Rory looked up, and the first thing he said, the first thing, at midnight, in an empty house, was, "Dad, don't be mad. I was going to have it all put away before Sunday." Dalton kept his voice level, because the boy's face was a seismograph and he refused to let the needle jump. "Where is everyone?" he asked. Rory shrugged with one shoulder, the way he did when a thing was too big to lift with both. "Cruise," he said. "They left Tuesday. It's on the fridge." The note was in Henrietta's handwriting. Dalton knew it instantly. He'd spent a career reading hands, and hers was all confident loops and entitled pressure, the script of a woman who has never once been told no. It was held to the refrigerator by a magnet from Duval estate liquidations, and it said, "Took the family on a cruise. 5 days, Bahamas. My treat. The family earned it. There's money for pizza. The boy isn't invited. He's your mistake, not ours." It was signed with just an H, the way queens sign things. Dalton read it twice. He was aware of his own heartbeat, of the hum of the refrigerator, of 30 years of his mother's voice saying, "We don't take what isn't ours," and of something older and colder assembling itself behind his ribs. They had left his son, a 12-year-old, alone in a house for 5 days with pizza money, the way you'd leave a key under a mat. And they had put it in writing and signed it, because it had never once occurred to any of them that Dalton Creel was anything more than the house they lived in and the license they borrowed respectability from. He folded the note along its crease, slid it into the inside pocket where he kept his loop and his cotton gloves, and turned around, and that was when Rory, still folding, still not looking up, said it. "Dad, Grandma doesn't know I found something unbelievable in her cupboard. She keeps the key on her neck, but she left in a hurry, and the little door doesn't actually latch if you know where to press. You should see this." And Dalton followed his son down the hall, and Rory pressed a knuckle into the carved rosette on the corner of Henrietta's grand locked cupboard, and the little door sighed open, and Dalton looked inside, and then Dalton Creel, exhausted, betrayed, 11 hours of road behind him, and his dead wife's ghost beside him, began, very slowly, to smile. Understand what Dalton was looking at, because it took even him a moment. The cupboard's upper shelves were theater, hymnals, a china shepherdess, the props of a harmless grandmother. But the lower compartment, behind the little door that didn't latch, was a filing system, and Dalton Creel had spent 20 years learning exactly what honest paperwork looks like so that dishonest paperwork would glow in the dark. There were 9 accordion folders, each labeled in Henrietta's confident hand with a surname and a year. Swan, 2019. Abernathy, 2021. 7 more. Inside the first one Dalton opened, a will, a power of attorney, and a codicil. 3 documents, 3 different elderly signatures, and all 3 witnessed by the same 2 names, in the same ink, in what his trained eye read instantly as the same hand disguising itself twice. Under the folders sat a cigar box, and in the cigar box were rings, wedding bands, engagement rings, a man's signet, each one tagged with a tiny string tag in Duval estate liquidation's lot numbering, each tag matched to a name and a date. Trophies, inventoried like stock, because Henrietta Duval had never in her life met a thing she loved that she didn't also price. And there, third from the left, tagged lot 44C, in the same neat hand, was a cameo locket on a worn gold chain. Celia's locket, the one that had vanished from a dead woman's jewelry box 6 months after her funeral, the one unsolved case of Dalton's career, sitting in his mother-in-law's cupboard with a price on it. Rory stood beside him holding a folded shirt like a shield and said, "That's Mom's, isn't it? I remembered it from the picture on your desk. That's why I kept looking through the rest. Dad, why does Grandma have Mom's necklace?" So now you know why he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. Men like Dalton don't get happy at midnight in front of evidence like that. He smiled because the picture finally resolved, the way a forged signature resolves under magnification. Every stroke that had felt wrong for 3 years suddenly explaining itself. The courtship that had found him, not the other way around. The company that got first call on half the estates in the county. The saint of 3 counties who hugged widows on Sunday and sold their houses on Monday. And a locket that could only have been taken from inside his own home, by someone with a key and a reason to believe a grieving man wouldn't look hard at family. He was not holding a family secret. He was holding an operation, and, purely by the grace of a cheap latch and a curious, unloved, magnificent little boy, he was holding it with 5 full days on the clock, while every player in it floated around the Bahamas on a ship called the Coral Sovereign, out of range, out of reach, and absolutely certain they had gotten away with all of it. Dalton put his arm around his son and said the sentence that reorganized both their lives. "Buddy, you didn't do anything wrong, and you're not spending another night in this house alone." Then he took out his phone, photographed the note on the refrigerator where it hung, and started making a list. If you've watched this channel before, you know the moment. Every one of these stories has it. The moment the quiet man stops absorbing and starts documenting. He did not touch the folders that night. That's the first thing to understand about how a professional does this. An amateur grabs the evidence, and 6 months later a defense attorney turns the amateur into the criminal. Dalton photographed the cupboard exactly as found, wide shots and detail shots, the way he'd document a disputed estate, and then he pressed the little door back until it sat flush, and took Rory upstairs, and made them both eggs at 1 in the morning, and let the boy talk. Really talk, for the first time in a year. And what came out over those eggs was worse than the note. The forgotten school pickups, the birthday dinner that got rescheduled off a calendar and never back on. The way Annika's voice changed the moment the front door closed behind Dalton's departing car, like an actress stepping off stage. The reason for the midnight laundry: Rory had learned to wash his own clothes at midnight, because when he'd left them in the machine during the day, they'd ended up on the garage floor. Grandma says the boys' things don't share a drum with family. Dalton listened to all of it with his hands flat on the table, nodding, keeping his voice in the register you'd use around a startled animal. And inside him, the cold thing finished assembling and stood up. In the morning, he called the client in Charleston and asked a favor: say nothing to anyone about the job ending early. Then he called the one person in the world he trusted with what came next. Priscilla Vang ran the Elder Justice Unit out of the State Attorney General's office, and she owed Dalton nothing except the professional respect of a woman who'd used him as an expert witness in 4 forgery prosecutions and never once watched him overreach. He met her that afternoon in a diner 2 towns over, slid his phone across the table, and talked for 40 minutes without raising his voice. Priscilla scrolled the cupboard photos twice. Then she said the thing prosecutors say when they're trying not to sound excited. "Mr. Creel, do you know what the Swan matter is?" Dalton did not. Loretta Swan, Priscilla told him, had been an Austri widow whose estate sale, run by Duval Estate Liquidations, had triggered a complaint from a daughter in Oregon who swore her mother's will had changed in the last 4 months of her life, cutting the family out in favor of a caretaking friend nobody could quite locate afterward. The complaint had died for lack of evidence. There had been 2 others like it, different counties, different years, same shape. A lonely elder, a late new will, a helpful friend, an estate sale that moved everything to cash fast. Nobody had ever been able to draw the line through the dots, Priscilla said, because the dots were spread across jurisdictions, and the paperwork always held up. Dalton took his phone back and enlarged the witness signatures on the Swan codicil, and turned the screen around, and gave her the sentence he'd given juries for 20 years. Paperwork holds up until someone who reads pressure and pen lift looks at it, and then it testifies for the other side. By 6 o'clock, Priscilla had a prosecutor on the phone. By 9 the next morning, a judge had signed the warrant, and Dalton Creel unlocked his own front door for an evidence team and pressed the carved rosette himself and stood aside. What they lifted out of that cupboard over the next 2 days redrew the map of 9 families' grief. The folders held originals, the real wills, the ones that predated the forgeries, kept the way blackmailers keep photographs, because Henrietta was too much of a collector to burn even the thing that could hang her. The cigar box gave them lot tags matching sale ledgers Joelle kept in a cloud account, and the ledgers gave them the buyers, and a locksmith's afternoon with the lower drawer gave them the masterpiece, a leather address book, decades old, in which Henrietta had graded elderly clients like livestock: widowed, no local kids, lonely, looks promising, a hunting log going back to when Annika was in high school. And it gave them one page that Priscilla Vang photographed and set down very carefully in front of Dalton, and watched his face while he read it. The page was headed Creel. It was dated 14 months before Dalton ever met Annika at that auction. Appraiser, widower, it read, in the neat hand of a woman pricing a lot. House paid. License is the asset. His signature launders anything. A, to work the sale. The boy is a complication. Dalton read it 3 times. His marriage, it turned out, had a provenance too, and he had missed it. The one attribution error of his career, made in his own kitchen. The evidence team found one more thing taped behind the cupboard's back panel. A fat envelope of printed texts and photos that even Henrietta had apparently considered leverage rather than family business. Annika and a man at a marina bar. Annika and the same man at a realtors conference in Ocean City. 3 years of messages. The man was Lyman Crow, the probate attorney whose name, Dalton now understood, appeared as drafting counsel on every single one of the 9 forged estates. The affair predated Dalton's wedding. It had simply continued straight through it, the way a business relationship does, because that's what it was. Crow drew the paper. Henrietta worked the widows. Annika worked the marks. And the mark of record, the one whose respected signature had been quietly certifying Duval sale inventories for 3 years, was him. Here is where an ordinary man breaks something. And Dalton went to the garage and stood in the dark for a while, and we'll let that stay between him and the garage. Then he came back inside, because there were 3 days left, and a trap to build, and the geometry of the thing had already occurred to him. The beautiful, closed geometry of it. Everyone who could warn anyone was on the same boat. Henrietta, Annika, Rudy, Joelle, the cousins. The entire operation, minus one lawyer, was sealed inside a steel hull in the Atlantic, with $11 a minute satellite internet, posting sunset photos, while on land, their cupboard sat in an evidence room, being photographed page by page. Priscilla's team used the window the way you'd use a gift. Subpoenas went out to banks that couldn't tip anyone off in time to matter. The Oregon daughter of Loretta Swan cried on a video call and overnighted a handwriting sample folder her mother had left. Chester Abernathy's grandson drove down from Wilmington with his grandfather's real will, the one the family had always insisted existed. And Lyman Crow, the one player still ashore, got handled with a con worthy of the Duvals themselves. A call from a lawyer friend of Priscilla's, dangling a fat, fictional estate, elderly seller, out-of-state heirs, needs probate counsel who can move fast. You were recommended by Henrietta Duval. Crow took the meeting in a wired conference room, and inside 40 minutes, relaxed and fishing for the hookup fee, he explained his own standard arrangement in the past tense with names in it. When the two agents at the next table stood up and introduced themselves, Crow looked at them, looked at his phone, and said 4 words that told you everything about that crew's loyalty. What did Henrietta keep? Crow flipped before sundown. Attorneys usually do. They've read the sentencing guidelines. In exchange for a plea, he gave Priscilla Vang the architecture. 9 estates over 11 years, roughly $2.4 million moved through sales, a 10th file already open. A retired ferry captain in Cambridge, named in Henrietta's book as Next Spring. And one detail that mattered more than all of it to the man sitting behind the one-way glass. The Creel marriage, Crow confirmed, had been planned like an acquisition. There had even been a timetable. Year 1, joint accounts. Year 3, they were in year 3. A revised will, drafted by Crow, moving Rory's inheritance from Celia, the house, and Dalton's death benefits under Annika's control, with Henrietta as backup trustee. The draft was already sitting in Crow's system, waiting for what his notes called the right season. And the boy? The boy was to be managed toward a boarding school in Virginia the moment the ink dried. They had priced Rory too. They had priced everything. That night Dalton sat on the end of his son's bed and told him the truth in the plainest words the situation allowed, because the boy had earned plain words. Some of the people in this house did very bad things for money. They are going to answer for it. None of it was ever about anything you did, and the cupboard you weren't supposed to open is going to give 9 families their mothers and fathers back. Rory was quiet for a while. Then he said, "So the laundry thing is over?" And Dalton said, "The laundry thing is over. From now on we do it together, Sundays, and we do it loud, in the middle of the day, like we own the place. Which," he added, "we do. We always did." The Coral Sovereign came up the Chesapeake on the morning of the 5th day in bright, postcard sunshine, and if you had been standing on the Baltimore cruise terminal that Friday, you'd have seen a scene worth the price of this whole story. The Duvals came down the gangway in matching family reunion t-shirts Henrietta had printed. Duval family, blood runs true, which is the kind of detail a writer wouldn't dare invent. Sunburned, laden with duty-free rum, laughing. Henrietta was first, because Henrietta was always first, and so Henrietta was the first to see the woman in the gray suit, holding up credentials, flanked by state investigators and 2 Baltimore police officers, and the first to attempt the transformation that had worked on 3 counties for 30 years. The soft face, the church voice, officers, there must be some confusion. It worked right up until Priscilla Vang said the words, "Search warrant, Tillman Street, executed Tuesday," and Henrietta Duval's hand went, involuntarily, in front of witnesses and 4 families filming the gangway with their phones, to the ribbon at her neck, to the key of a cupboard 200 miles away that was already empty. That gesture ended up in the trial exhibits. The prosecution called it consciousness of guilt. Rory, who watched the arrest footage exactly once, years later, called it what it was: Grandma checking on her stuff. Annika was taken at the bottom of the gangway. She scanned the crowd over the officer's shoulder, and whatever she was looking for, it wasn't her husband. and it wasn't there. Rudy made it 30 yards toward a taxi rank, which became its own charge. Joelle, the bookkeeper, was crying before anyone reached her, and by Monday her lawyer had called Priscilla to talk, which is how bookkeepers survive. Dalton was not at the terminal. This is the part I respect most, and it's why this story belongs on this channel instead of the evening news. He'd been offered the moment, Priscilla herself said, most men would want to watch, and he turned it down, because that Friday was a school day, and he had promised Rory pancakes and a hardware store run, because the two of them were rebuilding the latch on a certain little cupboard door, for the next family, for a laugh, for the principle of the thing. The revenge, the real revenge, was never the gangway. It was what happened over the following year, executed with an appraiser's patience, entirely inside the lines. Dalton's testimony, pen pressure, pen lifts, letter forms, the tradecraft of a man who had authenticated ink for 20 years, walked the jury's signature by signature through 9 forged instruments, and the state's forensic examiner confirmed every call he made. Henrietta Duval was convicted on 26 counts: forgery, theft by deception, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, racketeering. She was sentenced to 22 years, and the judge, in a line the local paper put above the fold, told her she had run a harvest, not a business, and had, quote, mistaken other people's twilight for her own field. Annika took 8 years on a plea, conspiracy and fraud, and the marriage was annulled. Not divorced, annulled, erased, on grounds of fraudulent inducement, a legal category that exists, it turns out, for weddings that were actually acquisitions. Crow was disbarred and did 30 months. Rudy and Joelle drew lesser numbers, and the civil forfeiture, the farmhouse profit, the boat, the trucks, every account Joelle had so tidily kept, was clawed back into a restitution fund that Priscilla's office distributed to 9 families, plus one retired ferry captain in Cambridge, who got a knock on his door and the strangest good news of his life. Sir, you were next, and you're safe now. And the locket came home. There's a legal process for reclaiming identified stolen property from an evidence inventory, and Dalton followed every step of it, and would tell you that filling out that particular form was the single most satisfying paperwork of his career. On the morning of Rory's 13th birthday, Dalton put the cameo locket, cleaned, restrung, appraised by its owner as priceless, provenance now proven in a court of law, into his son's hands, and told him what Celia had said. It points home too. Rory wears it inside his shirt on important days. The Tillman Street house got quiet in the best way. The in-law suite became a workshop where a teenager takes apart clocks and puts them back together better, at a bench by the window, which is where his mother would have wanted the bench. Duval Estate Liquidation's client list was picked up, at auction, with the court's blessing and a certain poetry, by an honest competitor, who hired, as their new authentication consultant of record, Dalton Creel. First thing he did was institute a rule, printed on every contract, and if you've been paying attention you'll recognize it. We don't take what isn't ours, because a thing you steal never stops belonging to somebody else. And on Sundays, on Tillman Street, in the middle of the afternoon, with the basement lights all the way up and the front door unlocked, a father and his son do the laundry together, loud, like they own the place. Because they do. They always did. So let's sit with this one for a second, because I think it's about more than a cupboard. Every con in this story ran on the same fuel, the certainty that decent people don't look. Henrietta hugged widows because she knew grief doesn't audit. Annika married a man because she knew loneliness doesn't ask for provenance. And they left a 12-year-old home alone with a cruel note because they were certain that the man they'd lived off for 3 years would swallow it like he'd swallowed everything else. Here's what they missed, and what people like them always miss. Quiet is not the same as blind. Dalton Creel spent 3 years looking like a mark because he loved his family more than he loved being right. The moment the evidence asked him to be right, he was ready, trained, patient, and absolutely without mercy inside the lines of the law. That's the lesson I'd hang over the door tonight. You don't beat a predator by out-shouting them. You beat them with documentation. Photograph the note. Keep the folder. Call the professional. And parents, hug your kids, but also watch the logistics. Nobody announces that they're erasing a child. It shows up small. The chair at the end of the table. The plate on the counter. The laundry at midnight. A kid doing chores alone in the dark isn't independence. Sometimes it's evidence. Rory didn't save that family because he was clever, though he was. He saved it because one adult finally came home early enough to see him clearly. Be that adult. Come home early. Look in the basement. And if this story kept you here to the end, you know what it means to me. I'll have another one waiting. Take care of each other. Good night.